Welcome to the Big Screen Symposium podcast. The Big Screen Symposium was held in Auckland at the Victory Events Centre on the 5th and 6th of April 2024. American writer, director and showrunner Lulu Wang speaks with New Zealand-based screenwriter Shuchi Kothari. They discuss Lulu's journey of finding her voice, both as a writer and in her directing work. They touch on her feature film, The Farewell, which draws on her own personal story. And they go into detail about her 6-episode drama series, Expats, which premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival and has quickly become one of the most highly rated shows of 2024. This session was proudly presented by Images and Sound. Please note, some film clips played at the live event have been edited out of this podcast.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mai haere mai, I'm Shuchi Kothari. Very happy to see all of you here. Very happy to have this moment, this hour with Lulu Wang. Thank you so much, Lulu. Thank you, Jackie, for giving me the privilege to do this, because it's given me an opportunity to get to know you a little bit, which has been wonderful, and eat food together, which you know anything about Lulu. I think she's the best person to have a meal with. Really, really looking forward to have this conversation be meaningful and honest, and something that is hard sometimes to do because you're opening session of a morning and it takes a while to warm up and you don't want to get too deep too quickly, but we do just have an hour. So maybe if that's good with you, Lulu, we will get too deep too quickly. First of all, congratulations for those who've been following Lulu's very recent series that's out on Amazon Prime. Please tell me you watched it. And if you haven't watched it, I'm going to say you've not watched it yet. Okay? It's a tremendous series, very ambitious, very deep, complicated. And at some level, the same person who made Farewell made this. And you can see a kind of a beautiful, I want to say kind of resoluteness of belief, but also tremendous growth. You know, you've just moved from a very fabulous, well-lauded indie film to 7 hours of, high-end television. Should we see a trailer for those who haven't watched The Expat yet? So just you get a feel, an affective feel of this wonderful work that Lulu's created. Like I said, if you haven't watched it, please watch now. It's really beautiful. And when I watched it, and I thought how we've always been told that to make something universal, you have to make something specific. And I think that is very much been your experience both with with Farewell and with Expats. Expats is very much about a particular group of people in a particular place at a particular time, Hong Kong, 2014, and group of women who are not from Hong Kong but living there, both as domestic helpers and also as women who've hired those helpers. But really speaking, if you distill it, for me it felt like it was about grief and love. These are the two things I just kept thinking about episode after episode. And then thinking a bit deeper, I thought, what is this grief and love standing on? And it's standing on ideas of home and exclusion and inclusion and belonging. And then I thought, what's that standing on? And then I thought, it's standing on perhaps your life as a diasporic Asian in the United States. And I just thought maybe you want to talk a little bit about how you end up in these projects and how these projects end up in you.
I can only create from who I am and where I am from. And I think that Expats was the first time it gave me an opportunity to make something where I wasn't being challenged on identity. I say that because as I was making The Farewell, I just thought, well, there's all these New York filmmakers, a lot of filmmakers who make autobiographical stories about their family. My story is not just about that. There's a plot and there's a mystery and intrigue and a question being asked, but they happen to be Chinese. But I was challenged, well, can you shoot it in, the States? Can they speak English instead? And there's all of these stipulations that reaffirmed to me what I've kind of known my whole life, which is that I don't belong, and the place that I am coming from as a storyteller doesn't match with what the audience will buy or wants. And I have to change in order to fit that. And that's kind of why I thought about going into public radio instead and thought I'm never going to have a career as a filmmaker. And of course, I made a podcast for public radio about the story. And then 2 days later, all of Hollywood was calling me to turn it into a movie.
For those who don't know this, Lulu did a piece for This American Life, and the producer of the show got in touch with her pretty much right away and said, this should be a movie. So,
well, the question he asked me was, are there any stories that you want to tell that Hollywood's not letting you tell? Oh. And I said, well, funny you should ask, because I have a script, I have a short story, I have an essay, like all versions of this story, because I had tried so many different ways to tell the story, and immediately got picked up, worked on it for about a month. It aired, and I thought this was such a pure experience where I was actually being asked, what happened? This is interesting. What happened? As opposed to, nobody really wants to have a story about a Chinese grandma who doesn't speak English, who's 80, and she's, at that age, she's going to die anyway. What are the stakes? It's not high stakes enough. Right. And so when I had this other experience of like, this is fascinating. I had no idea this was a cultural thing. And what's that about? And what did your mom say? And how did you navigate that? How did you feel? What did you do? I thought this is the kind of storytelling I want to do. That's very rooted from exactly where I am. And, but of course, then the producers called 48 hours after the show aired and said, this is of course a movie. And so as I was saying with Expats, I didn't have that. I think maybe because it stars Nicole Kidman, in a way it was like, levels everything else out. You can have all of this other stuff, but you have a movie star at the lead of it, then, you get this balance, right? You're going to attract a certain audience because of that. But then through that, I get to do all of these other things that were really unique that I felt like I hadn't seen a lot on screen, which is exploring diaspora and have all these other lead actors who we haven't seen in roles like this, from Brian T to Sorry You Blue to Ji Young Yu, who's a newcomer. But you get all of these fresh faces and opportunities for actors to do things that they haven't done.
I would like to circle back to that in a moment, because while I agree that, having someone like Nicole Kidman balances that out, it could also have potentially created problems.
Yes.
Because it's very difficult to have someone of that stature be at the center of something and still you being able to do the things you wanted to do, to cast it the way you want, to divide the stories the way you want. But we'll circle back to that in a moment. I'm going to go back to what you said about those early days of trying to convince people that the story you wanted to tell needed to be told in the way that it is. Everything from, I'm talking about the farewell now, from casting to language, right? The fact that about 80% of the film is in Mandarin, or some huge,
like 75.
75 there. I knew the stats would be something that you have had to wrestle with while talking to producers. The fact that, many faces are faces that people don't know. This is Awkwafina's first dramatic role. Tell us a little bit about getting such a personal project. This is your family. And I ask this question particularly in this audience because many times we are told, let the first film be personal. And I know this is not your first feature. But how is that personal navigated in a system where being who you are is not considered the best thing to be? So what was that negotiation to get Farewell to look the way it did, to sound the way it did, to feel the way it did?
Yeah, I mean, it is going up against a system that is set up for a different kind of audience than maybe what I thought my film was going to speak to. And trying to break some of those barriers. For example, with the language thing, it was like, well, this isn't, prejudice. This is just how it works. broadcast television has 2 categories. If you have anything over 60% in a foreign language, they consider it a foreign film and they don't broadcast it. And so then we lose out on this portion of the pie. And so what do you say to that, to a producer who's putting money in and say, and they're saying, if we lose out on this portion, then it doesn't make sense for us to give this much money, then we have to give this much money. So all of those things, and hopefully those things are changing as we have more. I think streaming has helped a lot with this, where there are a lot more. There's more global interest. Like, these streamers really want shows that speak globally to all their territories, and so that's. That means that it influences the kind of shows that they make and the number of languages that they're allowed to have. But broadcast was not that way. So, yeah, it is a negotiation. And, in a way, I think about that whenever I see a person of color making anything. I think sometimes people have there are criticisms even from within the community of like, well, this was made for a white gaze, or they're somehow like selling out, or this or that. And I just think, well, we live in a white supremacist society. And so there is so much to negotiate that how do you detach that kind of internalized thing and then try to make the thing within a system that doesn't allow you to make the thing. And so I kind of now just raise my eyebrow at that kind of critique. Because yeah, and also, yeah, it is internalized, but I think that also part of being a filmmaker in the diaspora is that you're never going to be one or the other. That's the point. You're somewhere in between.
And I think you've used that, and I don't mean use is the wrong, word to employ, but you've been able to tap into that in-betweenness to create nuance in your work, which I find really beautiful, because I think part of what you said, that it's one, you resist, as in resist labels, but labels are put on you. You can't say, I've got all the agency in the world to resist a label. You are labeled, whether you like it or not. So how do you then still pursue your authentic voice, your own sense of self, however hybrid that sense is? And maybe you could talk a little bit, Lulu, about that authenticity first in Farewell and then in Expats, because ostensibly one would think that Farewell, it was easier for you to be authentic in the Farewell because that was your story, that was your family story, it actually happened. This is not a made-up grandmother who's been diagnosed with cancer. This was your grandmother. So one could, argue that it was easier, and I know it's not, but it's easier to be authentic when one is telling your own story than it is when you tell the story of somebody else. But you have found a way to be authentic in both these pieces that are at some level very, very different, and yet I see them quite similar in terms of certain things that they're unpacking. So could you tell us a little bit about how you chase this authenticity? Because you still had to fictionalize it. You took the truth, but you had to, it's not a webcam. And it's the Hitchcock's idea about film not being a slice of life, but a slice of life. It's so orchestrated, and yet it must feel like it just, comes from the heart. How do you do that?
I think at the end of the day, you have to just tell a story about people, right? It has to be a story where how do they feel? What have they? It requires empathy. I think that might feel obvious, but it's having empathy for your characters. But I also think that this term authenticity is a double-edged sword, because if you ask my mother, she doesn't think the Farewell is very authentic. She thinks that the mother was very mean and inaccurately portrayed, and that the grandmother is way too nice and inaccurate, which is inaccurate, and that, my perspective of my grandmother is not a whole perspective, because my grandmother's nice to me, and I didn't witness all of the horrible things that she did to my mother. But I said, but it's not my mother's story,
yes.
Right? And so just because it is autobiographical, sometimes the people even closest to you feel like it's not.
Yeah.
And so I think we have this false idea that when we try to represent our community, that our community will just embrace you and love it and go, finally, I'm seen. And often it's quite the opposite. If you try to write a memoir about your family, let's see how many people feel really excited about being finally seen. So I think you can't worry about that, and because we're trapped between our community and trying to represent them, even though there might be pushback. And then, when I was making the farewell, especially people saying this is way too Chinese and you have to do this. And so to make it more palatable for a Western audience. And so you just can't really be swayed one way or the other and kind of go down a path where you go, okay, well, who is this character? Where are they from? And I often will shift, like even casting Awkwafina, her Chinese wasn't as good as mine. Yeah. That wasn't a brag or anything. Her Chinese isn't as good as mine. She didn't spend any time. She's only half Chinese, and she was really nervous about taking the role because it was written to have a lot more Chinese. And I had even pushed back and saying, well, I want it to be this way. That's what is authentic. Yeah. But when we cast Nora, because her Chinese wasn't as fluent, I said, that actually works for the character fine. It does. Because that's in a way like she can speak English with her parents, and then speak it with her, with the family in China, the uncle and grandma. And it even more shows how she's an outsider. Exactly. And she's much more assimilated in American culture. Whereas when I go back to China, sometimes people mistake me for local because I don't have a huge vocabulary, but I can speak it without an accent.
Right.
And so that's one example of like not staying true to the facts, but going, what is the story really about? And you have to give up, in a way, your attachment to autobiographical or what's real to servicing the theme and the character of the story that you're telling.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I said, it seems ostensibly authentic, because the minute someone hears about autobiography, you just think, oh, well, this happened and you wrote up what happened. But I am going to ask you a little bit about your mother, and maybe that shows about, tells you more about my complicated relationship with my mother. But I ask this because for those of us who are working through family stories, how much in the process of, how much was your family aware of what you were doing till it was done?
They were aware, but I didn't really have them, watch anything. I did have my parents read the scripts because I wanted it to be, this is my pursuit of getting something right.
Yeah.
Which I guess is both the necessary pursuit and also a false one, because you can never, as I mentioned earlier, get it right. And you can't write someone else's script. You have to, at the end of the day, write the story that you know. But I had them read the script, and the first time my dad read it, he was like, "This, why are you making this? People, why? No," he said, "Why are they giving you money to make this?" He said, "This isn't interesting at all. This is just what happened to us." So, and then there was some hairy moments throughout the process of developing with them. So I cut them out of the process and decided, I'm just going to make this movie myself and not ask. And then the first time they saw the film was at Sundance. And that's when my mother cried and said, "She's so mean. Why would you, make it her like that? That's not accurate." And my brother said, "Mom, that is exactly like you."
Thank God for a sibling who has your corner. The team that you put together for the farewell, it's interesting because it was a team that stayed with you through a much bigger project later. Can you talk us a little bit about how you chose the people to collaborate with? Because you are a really collaborative filmmaker. You work very closely with a lot of people quite early in the process. It's unusual or not that common. So can you talk us through a little bit about how your process of DP, production designer, who knows the world, who doesn't know the world? How much does it matter?
Yeah, I think before I made The Farewell, I had done this film called Posthumous, and it's like a screwball romantic comedy in Berlin, and I didn't have as much. It wasn't as personal, and I just didn't have as much creative control because because of the financing and where it came from, and shooting in Berlin, we had to hire a certain number of local teammates, and so I thought for many, many years, if I get to make another movie, I want to make it really personal, and I want to be very intentional about my team. And because I didn't go to film school, that's what I had heard from people. Oh, if you go to film school, the greatest thing that you can get out of it is the network of people, your collaborators, that you meet at that stage, and you can grow and develop together, and that's invaluable. And I never got that. And so I just kept trying to figure out how was I going to find those people for me. And then once I found them, I had done a short, and I met Young Ok Lee, who is a Korean-American filmmaker, production designer, and Anna Franquesa Solano I met through Young. And Anna had mostly done a lot of documentaries and very small movies. And it was about 2 weeks before I had to go to China to prep. And my DP that I'd hired dropped out.
Got a better gig?
No, he was afraid of the food. Oh, I'm sorry. It was very last minute. I was like, we're leaving in 2 weeks. He's like, I just, for my diet, I thought about it and I can't do it. I don't know if it was a health thing or anything, so I don't want to laugh, but it was very sudden, last minute. He was like, I don't think I can, accommodate what I have to eat there. And so it was real, obviously, this is when they say in indie film, you have to look at every crisis as a blessing in disguise. Because, I got a list. I got many, many lists from agencies and everything. And at that point, I thought, this is really an opportunity to make sure I find the right person, even though I have 2 weeks before I leave. And I got lists and lists of people, and my producers started getting really frustrated. And they said, well, why can't you just pick someone? All of these people in these lists, first of all, predominantly male. Not that I was specifically looking for a woman. I was looking for the right person. But I looked through the list, and I was looking at all these reels, and I just said, I don't feel anything when I watch this work. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. I don't really know what you're supposed to look for when you're hiring someone that you've never met. You're just looking at a short clip of stuff that they've shot. That's pretty. Well, that's beautiful. That's nice. But how do you pick? And so for whatever reason, I just kept saying, no, I don't feel anything. And my producer's like, oh my God, what are you trying to feel? Come on, this person went to Sundance 5 times. This person's been nominated for an Academy Award for their short. And this person's done this and this. And why isn't that good enough for you, Lulu? I said, because I'm not looking at credits. I'm trying to, this is such a personal project. I need to feel a connection through the work. And Young was having drinks with Anna in New York during Tribeca. And she said, I'm actually out with this woman. And she just came back from shooting a film in China. She's not Chinese. She's Catalan from Spain. But and I said, well, you're hanging out with a DP. We're looking for a DP, right? She goes, oh, well, I'll send you her website. And she had none of the credentials that my producers would have wanted. She'd mostly done documentary work, but I looked at her work and I just immediately was like, that's it. That's what I've been looking for, this feeling. There was just an emotional quality in her camera work. I could feel who she was as a person through her camera work. And I didn't know what to look for, but I just felt it. And so I fought for her. And my producers were like, we sent you all these people. This woman doesn't have the credits. What are you doing? And I said, it's her or no one. And at that point, Yang said, well, she just got back from China and she's ecstatic about being back home, and said, I'm never going back there again. So then I had to convince her to do it and said, I have this project. We're leaving in 2 weeks. Would you go back? And she was like, no. And then, she said she had to think about it and finally said yes. And so I think once you find those people, we really challenge each other. That's part of my non-negotiable now every time I do a project, because I don't want to grow if that growth means I have to do it without them.
Beautiful.
Because I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think that's real growth. That's not to say don't work with new people. Like if that feels right for you, then do it. But I think it's just this weird thing where people go, oh, I love this thing that you made. Because we love this thing you made, we want you to come over here and make this thing. But we don't want any of the people you made it with. We just want you. And you're like, how does that make any sense?
Yeah. Because so much of what you made is because of the people you made it with,
Absolutely.
And it's, we all talk about this as a highly collaborative medium, but then when directors sometimes get opportunities to do something bigger, they often move on without the teams that got them, where they are. And of course, if that dynamic didn't work out, if for whatever reason working with Anna wasn't, good, then I'm sure she wouldn't have moved on and you wouldn't have taken her on this journey to your next feature and then Expats. But obviously something beautiful, you share something lovely with her. And
yeah, I mean, I have her read, books and scripts pretty early on now. Like we have conversations really early on because, you're asking them to spend X number of years of their lives on a project. And so I want to make sure it's something that they find interesting, that they actually want to move to Hong Kong for a year during the pandemic and live there. And
small ask.
Yeah. And so that's just how we work now. And they're very involved very early in the process too, because as I write, I include the visual language and tone is so important because the script, if you read the farewell, you might not read it as a comedy. It's not necessarily written with jokes or punchlines. And yet, there's a lot of laughter when audiences watch it. And that's just not because it was written as a joke. And so how does that translate? And so that's something that I try to include as much of that tone as this more mystery, even though it reads as drama, but the way the camera pushes in, is actually creating tension and almost like a horror film or like all of that. I want to have a sense of that early on for myself.
Well, tone, perfect segue, because tone is often a nightmare. It's a nightmare on page because people don't always read tone on page. Sometimes tone is difficult to communicate if you don't have a huge body of work, prior body of work. You are tonally tricky, right? Which is, I think, your kind of USP because is it a comedy? Is it a drama? Is it a, the dreaded dramedy word? Is it, am I meant to laugh? Have you been told, have you been pushed in to decide, Lulu? Are you making something, sad or funny? Have you felt like you've been pushed into these corners and you've kind of gone?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the farewell, I was definitely told, like, with the draft, like, we should make it more of a comedy. And I said, no, but it will be funny. You have to trust me. And on Expats, when Nicole Kidman first reached out for me to do the project, she said, you made cancer funny, so I think you can make anything funny. Expats is quite dark. Can you make it funny? I was like, oh God, now that's my lot in life is to like people give me really dark projects and go,
lighten them up, Lulu.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that there is, but I don't think in terms of genre in that way. I mean, I think, God, I would love to make something a little bit lighter now that I've made this more serious show. But I'm always looking for the humor. I think that we have to, like, if you allow the audience to laugh, then they feel the sadness and the grief and all these deeper emotions even more. And I'm also just more interested in things that are unexpected. When something is sort of one tone, it can wear on you.
There's a lovely scene from the farewell, which I'd like for us to see, where it's a very serious moment between the uncle and Nora, played by Awkwafina, when she goes back to China. And just prior to that, the family has explained why telling the grandmother is not a good idea. And there's this lovely line of, it's our grief to bear, it's our burden to bear, not hers. Her illness is our burden to bear as a family. And then they go down this street, and the uncle's talking, and she keeps replying, and it's serious, and then it gets funny. That scene just starts serious and becomes funny, and I think it's a lovely one to see and for you to talk about.
Yeah, this is an early scene. The one where you're talking about happens later. So it's not, she doesn't quite know yet why they're doing this. This is just sort of the introduction. And it's actually the scene that inspired the whole movie. And it would haunt me in my dreams, the way that he would ask these questions. And of course, as I was writing the movie, I kept getting this note of like, well, the scene doesn't move the story forward. Nothing happens in it.
It says so much.
Yeah. And so that's why I think we can watch it.
It says so much. It's a beautiful scene. And the graph of the scene is so beautiful because it is, you feel that weight and sadness. And by the end of the scene, we are laughing. So it's a tricky thing to achieve.
Yeah, it's funny because I remembered another note that I kept getting was like, well, this feels like exposition. It feels like a character that's explaining the premise of the movie. And I said, well, that's the point. Like, he's explaining the premise of the situation. Like, my uncle literally did that. And well, how are we going to know that it's not, is the audience going to just feel like, oh, we're being explained the premise? So no, because we're experiencing it through Billy's perspective. Exactly. And she's being told something she already knows, which is the point of the whole scene. It's not the audience being told something. And that's what makes it funny. But, some of those conversations that you have in development is really tricky because it's like, one step this way and you're in exposition land, one step over here, but you're missing the entire point of the scene. And
but I think it is knowing that last I know is the great cap to the punchline. You know what I mean? Because exposition, if the scene was expositional, he would be saying what he's saying, and she would be saying, yes, but it's breaking my heart, and you have no idea how hard it is for me to marry me, and you're not the only one who gets to decide, and you only think about internet medicine, and you didn't see a doctor, and that's really a problem, and this is why I don't like the family. Bad writing. But you know what I mean? Like all these ways in which a scene would just sink. And it's beautiful because while he's doing all the talking, she just goes, I know. It's lovely, really lovely. And I think these are the kind of, moments where you are in someone's world and you've kept us in Billy's world, which is also good because most of this audience in the US was never going to be fully entering that space as an insider, that you allowed them in with a certain sense of not belonging. In the same way that maybe if you reversed the gaze and you were writing about you in the US, it would also be a certain sense of not belonging.
Yeah.
So going back to where we kind of started, that this idea of playing with these dualities of where is home, not home, who's included, not included. And how do you write about these things without being harsh on the character, without being harsh on the people who don't get it? And I think that gets teased out in a much more complicated way with the expats.
Yeah, I think that we are, living in a time that is very polarized and binary. And I think that particularly when things get confusing, boundaries get blurred, out of fear and protection, people want to retreat back into what they know and kind of shut the door. And they hope that they want you to do the same. They're like, you belong over there or you belong over here. Pick one or the other. That's it. And of course, I, like many people now, don't actually just belong in one or the other. And so it is about empathy, and it's something I've thought a lot about. We talk so much about empathy, particularly on social media. You must have empathy for this group of people and that group of people. But the empathy is usually extended to a particular group that maybe elicits sympathy, right? Oh, well, they're poor or they're this, or I relate to them. And actually, I think empathy is different than pity. And we don't talk enough about the fact that that's not the same thing. Just because you feel bad for someone, something bad has happened to them, and they're poor, they're sick, or what. That's not really empathy.
Yeah.
And so in looking at a world where there's privilege, and that's something that I wanted to examine without it being a satire. There's a lot of shows and films about, the rich and about like anyone who's privileged and it being a satire. And I actually think that when we just laugh at them or portray them as evil, that we feel distanced from that, right? And so often it might feel benign, or that the power dynamics, for example, between an employer and the employee, they can be much more subtle. And it requires empathy for both sides to really examine the situation in a realistic way. And so I wanted to create characters that we both empathize with and also related to in some ways, but then also have judgment towards. We can also see ourselves in them. It's the only way that we can look at ourselves and have awareness to say, and one of the themes in the show too is this idea of victims and perpetrators. And we think that people are either victims or perpetrators. But the truth is you might be the victim of your own story and the perpetrator of someone else's. And so that was that was the premise into which I entered the series with the writers that I was working with, where I just said, it's like a kaleidoscope. Let's just keep looking at it through different angles and let's keep shifting. And we develop the story that way. It's a multifaceted as opposed to being plot driven. Like, okay, this is a good person, this is a bad person, and then we go forward.
Let's talk about that a little bit in terms of your decision to do it. For some of you might have, heard Lulu's interview even more recently on RNZ here in New Zealand, that obviously this was not a project to which you ran with, open arms and went, oh yeah, yes, great. Thank you, Nicole, for bringing this to my notice. In fact, she had to chase you, which is, I love that image. I just love that image of Lulu doing this and, Nicole having to chase you. But that she really wanted you to do the project and you were not sure for a while. So can you talk us through why? Like really honestly, openly, why? Why, despite liking the novel, you were going, good novel, maybe I'd be an audience for this, but I don't want to make it?
I think it's just the way that I think about growth, which might be quite different from how Hollywood often sees or applies growth to you. I mean, that's quite American. Everything is like immediate, like your career, you made a small film about your family, it did well, and now let's like inject steroids and, throw you into this like massive project with none of your own team that you made the other thing with, and all these movie stars and all of this money and hope for the best because you're gonna just do great, right? And then when you don't, they go, wow, she was, a one-hit wonder. She did great there, but clearly not a good filmmaker. And so I just didn't want to set myself up for failure. And I guess I, in a way, knew that if I, got plopped into this much bigger machine, and I didn't have my team, and I couldn't really tell my version of the story, that I would get lost. And the only thing I have is my reputation and my name. And if the project's not good, or if it's not even about good or bad, like if it doesn't reflect me, I can't go out and be like, well, I know that doesn't really reflect me, but here are the problems that happen and why I did. No one cares, right? What you see on screen. And I just couldn't do that. And Nicole is such a huge star. I felt like I was going to get swallowed in this like massive project. And so I expressed that to her, and I basically thought that I was passing. And I said, well, I would need my own team. It would be about X. If I was to do it, just if you were to do it, what would you do? I said, I think that I would direct all of them. I would make it shorter series, 6 episodes. I would want to have a huge focus on characters that are not you. You would probably be an extra, just kidding, like a background player in this episode. But it would be the heart of the series for me. I'd want to screen it at festivals. Like I had all these ideas early on. And I wouldn't want to do it linear fashion. It wouldn't be a traditional whodunit plot. It would be much more reflective of the book, which is about the inner lives of these women and these characters. And I'd want to flesh that out even more. So I gave a whole list of stuff thinking, well, there's no way, because they'd been developing it for a year already and had all
the stuff that you'd been given, the material, all the stuff that, they developed had more of a whodunit slant, did it?
Yeah. And I felt that that's what the studio really wanted. And so basically I thought that I was passing and saying, love your work. Let's find a different project sometime to do. And she called me back like 48 hours later and said, okay, it's yours. I was like, whoa, what do you mean? I said, the book, like hire who you want, put together a writer's room, write it exactly how you pitched to me, and let's do this thing. And that was not what I was expecting.
Be careful what you wish for. But through the process, were you going back to your team because everyone was stepping up, doing this much, as you said, on steroids, much bigger project? What in your process changed? And I'm not asking this because film is film, television is television. Those lines are, totally blurred. And I mean, come to think of it, you have a feature size episode in Expat, I think episode 5, that's 90-ish minutes right there. So I don't mean in the kind of simple way of saying, oh, because you've done film before and this is TV, your process might be different. I'm just saying the scale was so huge and so different. What if your process remained the same and what changed? And what could you talk us through in terms of craft?
I think that our approach was really similar, but it was just much more challenging. So my DP and I, we always shot list every single scene before we shoot it. And on the farewell, we shot 26 days. We would location scout, and we shot list on location because it's because if you don't know what the location is, how are you going to really be clear about the mise en scène? And we're going to move from this room to this room and blocking, and we do a lot of scenes where there's not a lot of cuts, and we really rely on the blocking to give it a naturalistic feel, and so we need to see the space, and it's one thing to do that on a 26-day shoot, where you have like a limited number of locations, and then this was well over 130 days or something like that of shooting, and sometimes we'd lock a location and then we'd lose the location, but we'd already shortlisted it and we'd have to get to another. And it was a constant negotiation because I'd say, well, we need another day then to re-shortlist it. And they're like, no. Like, trust me, if we don't get that, then on the day when we show up on set, we're going to have to figure it out and we're going to lose time. And the amount of time that we have to shoot, in television, it's a lot less time to shoot. I said, we don't have that kind of time to waste. I can't get to set and have the actors sitting around waiting while we figure it out. And I also didn't want to compromise by going, okay, well, you sit there, let's put 2 cameras and just cover it. That's just not the kind of filmmaking that we do. So that was a challenge, keeping the continuity in mind, because, there was we were shooting over 6 months. And so we'd shoot one scene, and the scene before that we shot 6 months ago. And we were like, where are we emotionally? What were the costs? Having to put everybody back into that space. And also the set builds, a lot of the interiors of, especially like all the expat apartments were built on a stage. And we really didn't want to work on a stage because for us, we just felt like, well, that's not indie filmmaking and it's going to look fake. Like you see these TV shows that are put on a stage and you can just tell the walls are artificial and you can remove all the walls and all of that. And it gives you great flexibility, but it just wasn't what we were used to in the kind of natural, authentic filmmaking, particularly in a place like Hong Kong. Yeah. But then we kind of came around to it because we scouted a lot of locations and they weren't great for what we were trying to represent for the wealthy class. And then we thought, well, the whole idea of expats is that they live in a bubble. They're quite removed from the city. So actually building it on a stage and having a bit of artificiality might help serve us.
That's true, yeah.
And so we were doing a lot of research on how to build on a stage and still make it feel really authentic. Do you do, green screen? Do you do, we ended up doing a backdrop that was like the size of this room, printed backdrop. And then Anna had an intern put Christmas lights in every other window, because they live on a hill, and you see all these like the skyline below them. So they're very separated from the city, and we learned that in order to make it feel really real, that you put little Christmas lights so that the flicker of the lights in the window in the distance actually feels real. And you can also cheat by putting real trees in the foreground. So the real trees help to feel the movement so that it distracts from like anything that looks fake in the distance. So there's all kinds of tricks like that that we had to learn, and then we had to make it rain inside of a stage like this, and then it would flood our set, and we're like, oh no. And so, and then the entire episode 5 is a typhoon coming. Yeah. So the entire episode, 96 minutes, is wind machine and rain machines, and combined with VFX. And so you want to use as much real rain as possible, and then you can add to it. But if you had no rain, it's much harder to look real, because you want the foreground to be real at the very least. It's easier to add background rain. So like the size of all of those things.
How did you figure all that out?
Research. I mean, we really did a lot of research, and we asked to see examples of our because also, people's ideas of what's realistic or like for special effects or visual effects is very different. And so someone coming from special or visual effects might say, well, here's some examples that, I think look really great. And you're like, yeah, that looks great in a sci-fi film. But, you're already in an unreal world. And so you're used to it in a way you buy it, right? But we're mixing effects with like practical shoots. We're in the streets of Hong Kong, and, and so it had to be it's actually much harder to do invisible effects than it is to do effects for like a big like science fiction project. And so they would show us things, and we would say, that doesn't look very real to us as an indie filmmaker who does practical shooting. And then we would find examples. And so it's just a lot of conversation and research.
Thank you. There are some questions here specifically about writing, and the reason I've not picked them up is because Lulu is doing a session tomorrow about writing methodology. So I think Mark and Diane and Michael and you might refer to that in that session so that there's no double up. But there's a question here which ties to what you were talking about, Lulu, in terms of control. We don't have the American style showrunners here yet in that same way, though of course increasingly it is a term and a role that's being acknowledged in the industry here as well. For you to showrun the Expats, never having showrun before, and obviously there's got to be a first time for anybody, but it's that weird thing about people don't want someone to showrun till they've showrun, and you can never showrun till you have. So it's a bit of a crazy loop. How did you? So some of your answer was in the fact that because Nicole was more keen to have you than perhaps you were keen to work on this, it kind of gave you, leverage really, that I'll do it my way or not do it at all. And I think having some of the same team work with you again also gave you that collaborative support.
Yeah.
That people are there to, help you as against, productively challenge you and support you as against, tear you down or think that you're a newbie and we are all established. So, we don't want to listen to what you're saying. But how did you maintain that sense of being a showrunner where you're taking the project into much more complicated terrain than what Amazon and perhaps even their early vision of the story was? So what did that role mean to you, just simply,
I mean, to be honest, I didn't think that much about that role because I had not worked in television before. But as an independent director, you're always producing. Like that is just part of your role, is to make it happen. And so I guess I didn't think about it as being that different. And in many ways, that's why Expats, of course, we had so much more resources and it was a much bigger production. But in terms of process, it still felt independent because we still had to fight to make things happen and to get the kind of locations. Like they wanted us to shoot in Malaysia, for example, for Hong Kong. And I said, Malaysia doesn't look like Hong Kong. And they said, yeah, but it's cheaper. So, but, and so having to like push for that and figuring out the budget so that we could do it that way. But to be honest, I think that showrunners, the traditional showrunner in television, are working with multiple directors.
Yeah.
And hopefully if I ever have the opportunity to do that, I don't know yet that I will, it's a different skill set because you are, like, I just had to talk to myself as the director.
Yeah.
And then on one hand, I'd be like, well, as a showrunner, this is over budget. As a director, I really want this.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the line producer. So my poor line producer had to, kind of was like, well, she's my boss as the showrunner, but as a director, she's asking for too much. But, I think working with multiple directors and making sure that they all feel like they have a real creative role, but at the same time, they have to fulfill not their own individual vision, right? But they have to follow the vision that's been set in the pilot for the show so it all feels cohesive. That's a whole different challenge.
Yeah. So I guess in a way, it's a crazy answer, but I feel like in a way you have to make an amazing indie feature and then someone wants you so badly that they let you do it your way. The reason I say this, and I'm being slightly facetious, is there is a lot of resistance to let people do things differently. The very fact that Anna hadn't made fiction, that she was a documentary DP, and you were absolutely certain that she was the right person, it's because we still live in this kind of risk-averse universe where everyone is looking for the next breakthrough thing, but never wants to put their neck on the line. So it's like, oh, but get a known quantity, get somebody who is within the field. It's like someone's done documentary so they can't do fiction. It's ridiculous, right? And to not have you hold this vision of 6 episodes yourself would have never made sense when you were directing all of them. In a way, you had to show run this Expats. You were directing every single episode.
Let me add to that one thing I was going to say.
Yeah.
I know it sounds silly to be like, go make this like hit feature film and then you will get to do this. I think the lesson there that's empowering for me is to work in a space in which you have that control. And I think the more that I work in this industry, the more I kind of go, it's kind of like living in a house. I'm perfectly happy in a small apartment. You can buy a huge house, but if you don't become dependent on that lifestyle and all of those things, then you're always going to have that freedom. Because there was a part of me that was like, I never want to leave my little small space because I don't feel... But it's not about where you actually are. You can go and do the big thing, but if you're not afraid to fail in that space, if you're given the freedom to really do something interesting and special and enjoy this big house that you're living in, because then if you don't get to do it again, I'm also happy in this other small space, and I get to go make another $3 million indie where I get to really express myself as an artist, and that to me is freedom, and it's the way to grow. And it's why I did Expats, and I thought, okay, this is an opportunity where I get to be in a bigger pond, but I still get to bring my team. I still get to do all of these things. So it's a learning opportunity. Why wouldn't I take it? And I think, so I think that, wherever you are, look for that space in which you get to express your truest self as an artist, because only by having that voice heard do you get other opportunities. So you have to always build from that place.
Well, what a lovely place to end, because I think it's so true that the freedom that you've maintained is the freedom that you've chosen because you're willing to not be addicted to a certain way of being. And I think that's an amazing, we forget that. You think it's like an upward ascend and somehow it's just going to be, in one direction. But if you're okay to be in any direction, I think that's an immense, a personal quality and gives you immense creative freedom. So we can't wait, Lulu, to see what you do next, whichever genre, whichever form you do it in. It's going to be fabulous. And Jackie's already sent me a message that we are 12 seconds over time. But thank you so much. And thank you so much for listening and your questions. And I hope that we answered some of them, and the rest will be answered hopefully tomorrow in tomorrow's session. Thank you, Lulu. Thank you so much.
Everyone.
The Big Screen Symposium 2024 was presented by Script to Screen. We gratefully thank our event partners, the New Zealand Film Commission, Images and Sound, New Zealand On Air, and Te Mangai Paho. Voiceover is by Jamie Irvine and the music is by Poddington Bear. You can read more about these speakers at our website, www.bigscreensymposium.com. This podcast is brought to you thanks to generous support from Images and Sound.